I'm Dr. Ray Middleton. I help people by delivering great training. Here's an example of an episode from one of my training courses. As we try to construct a common language, it helps to think about what the cultural divides might be between us as a worker and the person that we're trying to communicate with. Cultural divides might be connected to lots of different things like ethnicity, class, gender, age, disability, housing status, income, or other cultural divides that we may need to cross in order to connect and communicate, build trust, and create a common language. Remember, Levy uses this metaphor of everyone living in a house of language. And we're trying to cross these cultural divides between our house of language and the person that we're reaching out to, in the hope of offering to be helpful on their journey through life. As well as listening for words, phrases, and metaphors that the person likes and values, there may also be phrases or words that are triggering, that they particularly dislike. For example, they may object to a particular diagnosis that they've been given within the medical model of mental health, such as personality disorder or schizophrenia. And they've a perfect right to have an opinion about that and not accept it if they want. There's lots of debate about that particular approach. They may find it labeling or stigmatizing, for example. So it's important to be sensitive to the words that the person reacts to negatively, as well as the phrases that they react to positively and value in terms of creating a common language to facilitate the work progressing. We can still acknowledge the difficulties people have, but simply rephrase them in a way that respects the person's views and opinions. For example, if someone collects a lot of belongings and does not throw anything away, they may dislike being labelled a hoarder. They may have had some difficult experiences of staff trying to address that issue in the past in an unhelpful way or controlling way, and they may associate that word hoarder negatively with some bad memories. But if they collect lots and lots of belongings when they do have a room to live in, it may become problematic. Let's be real about it. But to talk about it, we just could maybe rephrase this as something acceptable, like saying, I've noticed you do like to collect things a lot. And they might agree with that. Yes, I do. And there'll probably be underlying reasons for that kind of attachment to objects. It might be to do with loss of someone in the past and then feeling safer. But it creates a language that allows you to talk about it. That's the point. It could be lots of different issues. It doesn't have to be about hoarding. But you're trying to create a language which allows you to talk about it without that person reacting. You could then say, you've collected a lot of things here, I can see, and the landlord's concerned about the fire risk. So being sensitive to the language allows you to move on and talk about a real concern, rather than the person just getting triggered into feelings of shame or anger and then just refusing to discuss the issue, which doesn't get us anywhere, does it? So Jay calls this process building the playground of language between our house of language and their house of language. So there can be a playground between our two worlds where we're trying to build the playground of language, where we find out what ideas and phrases are welcomed into their world and which are not, and people have a strong reaction to. We search for some mutually acceptable terms to help talk about the challenges, difficulties and goals that we're working on together. Appreciating our house of language and the client's house of language takes skill, patience and practice. And then an even more skillful process is needed when we try to bridge the person into another service, because the new service may use its own jargon and language, and we want to bridge them in there. We've done the work of building up our common language, but we want to bridge them into this other service in the community maybe that might be helpful. For example, a peer support group may have its own jargon that can be a little bit confusing for people unless you've integrated and found your kind of sense of equilibrium in there, and then you may use it without even realizing it's a kind of jargon language. But for an outsider, it might seem strange. Or a mental health service locally may insist on using clinical language such as diagnosis. I mean, it might be more progressive and have lots of alternatives to the medical model, but it may be, that they insist on using a diagnosis that the person finds stigmatizing and offensive, and they don't agree with. There are other alternative ways to think about mental distress than mental illness, and that's a valid kind of conversation that's going on. So the house of language of another service like mental health or a peer support group or a resource represents a third house of language, doesn't it, using Jay's metaphor? My house of language, the person's house of language, and then this other world. Perhaps a different kind of language than we'd ordinarily use. Some of those environments that we want to help could potentially be helpful for someone. For example, the local mental health service may have a particularly strong attachment to the medical model. And that when you talk to them, there's lots of talk about diagnosis, treatment, hospitals, that type of stuff. In that narrative, it's a health narrative, isn't it? The challenge is to create a bridge of language to help that person enter into that world or new environment if they want to try it out. The new service may or may not be helpful to them. For them to try it out may help, if the staff in that service to also understand that person, the staff might be willing to adapt their language a bit. If they think that a diagnosis they particularly object to, they may be a compassionate, understanding staff, flexible, able to use a different language. If you explain that they react to certain phrases, they may, be quite willing to use a different phrase. Perhaps they could rephrase things. For example, I'll give you a practical example. I have been part of a working group in our local mental health trust for about 8 years, and the working stream is around personality disorder services in the local state-funded mental health trust, statutory services. And we considered the debate around the diagnosis. There's lots of discussion, and decided to change our name as a group to, I don't work for the trust, but I'm invited as an outsider to participate, to change the name from personality disorder working group to personality difficulties associated with complex trauma, which is a more descriptive, more compassionate, maybe less labelling shift. So it shows that it is possible, even at a very kind of senior meeting, looking at the whole, trust-wide set of services, there is flexibility. Another example could be about housing, and if you think about housing, services for older people. There's a really good example that's not to do with mental health. Again, the language used could be very difficult for someone if they haven't seen themselves as an older person or needing services for more senior members of the community. They may reject potentially helpful housing, which has been ring-fenced for older people, if it's communicated in a language that makes them feel devalued or in a language that does not resonate with their world. And so they might just think, I can't see myself because of the language you're using about this kind of sheltered accommodation, maybe. So rephrasing some of the ways that sheltered housing for older folks is described could help them consider that option. Do you see how it's just about being sensitive to language and maybe the assumptions people have made around a certain kind of language? And that service might end up being the best option for them. So if we can help to bridge a language for them to consider it, then it may end up being really helpful. It helps to think about the language use, and it may help the transition into this new environment to think about the kinds of words and phrases that might be used in that new environment. We're trying to find the words and phrases that resonate in the world of the person we're trying to help. I hope you found that helpful. For more information about the training I can offer, email me at ray.middleton@ladderforlife.com or sign up for one of my free trauma-informed courses by clicking the link in the comments. Like and subscribe for more helpful videos, or post a question in the comments and I'll reply.